All right, awesome. Hey everyone, Don Dodson, Dodson Designs, and welcome to Leather Making 101. Take these off because, yeah. Anyway, so apologies for the little bit of the delay there, but wasn't working so well on my phone. So let's just get things started before one of my batteries runs out. Okay, so we're here to talk about Leather 101. And by the way, I can't really see any comments, so I'll work on maybe fixing that in a sec. But for the moment, let's just sort of get started. All right, awesome. Hey everyone, Don Dodson, Dodson Designs, and welcome to Leather Making 101. Take these off. Anyway, so apologies for the little bit of the delay there, but wasn't working so well on my phone. So let's just get things started. There we go. All right. Better. Okay, guys, sorry. So we're going to talk about leather today. And I'm sure that there's lots of questions. And like I said, if I can manage to get my the chat, because I was going to do this on my phone. So I have to switch everything back. I can, monitor comment in case somebody has some questions, and hopefully it'll work for everybody. So first thing, what is leather? Simply put, leather is the skin of an animal, and typically mammals. Although you could conceivably argue that like other things like snakes, reptiles, and things like that, that's leather as well. And what do? It's the skin that we've stabilized. Okay, so we've made the skin stable so that we can, so it doesn't rot, so that you can actually use it, and it won't rot on your body, and it'll be stretchable, flexible. It'll stay solid this whole time, and well, you can on your body. And it's made this way through something called the tanning process. And simply put, the tanning process is, and it won't rot on your body, and it'll be stretchable, flexible. It'll stay solid this whole time. Sorry. And you on your body. There we go. All these different things going on here. I should be able to see the chat now. Okay. So what does this mean? So the tanning process is where we take the collagen, the sort of wet stuff that's inside the skin, and we add the tanning agent to make that stick to that. Oftentimes these are things called tannins, and tannins are, basically something basically something we use to create, keeps wanting to do something there. So the tannins are usually in vegetable tan leather is roots, bark, vegetable type matter, and those kind of things will allow us to stabilize a long time for vegetable tan stuff. That is what I oftentimes call the pink stuff. So it's this tan, it's oftentimes kind of stiff, as opposed to chromium tan, where we take chromium type agents and use those. All right. Chromium salts, so heavy metals, to make the leather to bind to the collagen, and then we get this sort of soft, flexible stuff that we oftentimes see. So what does that mean? That means that when we're making leather type stuff, that will affect what kind of leather you're going to want for what kind of job. Okay. So if I'm going to make something that's a garment, like a coat or something like that, from Silver Wolf Leather does, then I'm going to probably want the chromium tan leather because it's softer, it's flexible, it works better. If I want to make something that's structured, like a belt or something like that, maybe even a hat, then I'm going to want to go with the vegetable tanned leather, because the vegetable tanned leather allows us, all right, to work better. It has more structure to it. It can be molded, whereas the chromium tan leather cannot. So I can wet this leather and mold it into a shape and it will stay that way. That's kind of important. So when we're working on these kind of things, you have to kind of think about what you want to make and what would be the best leather to use in that instance. Okay. So if we're going to kind of look at this from as you trying to make something yourself out of leather, then you would want to consider what you want to do, what you want to make out of it, so that you know what leather and what techniques are going to work best for you. All right. So one of the things that we oftentimes I get asked a lot is, what kind of techniques do you need? What skills do you need? And what tools do you need? Well, let's talk about the techniques just briefly, because again, if I'm working on the soft chromium tan leather and I'm making a coat or a jacket or a shirt or a vest, I'm going to use a somewhat different set of tools than if I'm going to make a pouch or a belt or something like that. Okay. Because I'm going to use a different kind of leather. They worked differently. And I'm going to have access to different sets of tools that is going to work better for me. So if I'm making a soft garment, then I can probably get away even with using some regular household grade leathers for the really thin leathers. And the medium ones, I need an industrial machine. They're still far cheaper than a leather machine I would need to sew something that's really thick like this, that has a lot of thickness to it. And that's like a $4,000 machine. But let's face it, we're in this as a hobby. We don't have access to that stuff necessarily. And if anything, we're going to be making this by hand. All of the techniques you use some are far more time consuming, um, depending on which process you're going to work through. So that being said, let's talk about tools. And while I do that, I'm going to quickly just jump in and Twitch and just see if there's any questions or if I'm even working properly, because I could just be talking to myself for all I know. Let's see. Yeah, it's really slow. Okay. So somebody asked, if you mold the sturdier leather and it gets wet again, will it still hold its shape? Oftentimes when it does get wet, it's how we treat it afterwards that will save that, and also how it's constructed. So if we make a molded piece, a lot of times that's sewn to a back or something that will help sort of support that, so it won't completely collapse, like a boot. Okay, boots are made from vegetable tan leather. If they get wet, they tell you not to stick it beside something. You won't want to put something on top of it, because yes, you could sort of unmold it. What's happening in this process is the moisture is binding to the collagen stuff, and the collagen's like a glue. So when you shape it and then it dries, that glue dries hard in place. So if it gets wet again, it could unmold. That's why it's important to protect it and put other things on top of it. Okay. So let's talk about the tools, and we can sort of go through them. Now, I'm going to go through the tools in sort of a certain order here of, excuse me while I indulge in some, it's not alcoholic. I'm going to focus on the easy stuff first and then more advanced tools as we go along. So when we're talking about leatherworking of almost any kind of thing, there's a couple things, techniques, like really broad concepts when it comes to leather, that you need to do. And this can apply to other things. You got to cut it, you got to stick it together somehow, and then you're probably going to adorn it somehow. And then in there are some sort of sub things like, I got to poke holes in leather. You almost always are going to have to do that, because part of that whole process is, you're going to want to attach it. And sometimes that means making a mechanical connection. Yes, you can use glues, but any kind of mechanical connection, mechanical meaning rivets or stitching, is going to be far more secure than just gluing it together with even a good contact adhesive. Okay, so it's important to understand that those kind of things are done. So cutting, there's lots of different tools to cut. This is a simple $1.99 utility knife, and so I do this professionally. We'll use that term loosely. It is my full-time job, and I use one of these. It's got snap-off blades, so I never have to sharpen the blades, and it goes really quick, and it's easy for me. It's cheap. I'm sure some people will scoff at that, And a bit about that in terms of leatherworking and almost any other craft you know of, there's always somebody who's going to say that they do it differently. And that's okay. All right. Because the truth of the matter is, there's a whole bunch of different ways to get to the end result. Some of them are more effective than others. So just understand that. So I may tell you how to do it one way, and then somebody else is going to tell you how to do it another way. And both ways are probably right if they've been doing it any length of time. There are some ways of doing stuff that might mess things up or make it more challenging or might provide a negative result further on down the line. But there's a lot of different ways to do this. So there's one way. I can also cut with one of these rotary type blades. This is good for leather up to a certain thickness. Leather is measured in ounces. Okay, so if we talk about a garment, all right, a garment like one of like this, then it's going to be super thin, and it might be anywhere from 1 to 3 ounce weight. Okay, and if you apply that to sort of like canvas and things that have a weight to it, it's sort of the thickness. Okay. And then there's a millimeters to this. You can look that up. I don't really know it off the top of my head. And then if I get to like this piece that I showed you here, this is 16 ounces of leather. Okay. I guess in theory, 1 square foot of this would weigh a pound, but that's not really true. So this is super, super thick. Okay. So I'm not going to be able to cut that very easily with this. And the negatives to this, these are great for soft stuff that's flexible and cutting straight lines and maybe some flowy curves, but it's not really good if I got to cut weird corners and stuff like that. That's where this is good. And then if you're an old salt, one of those professional dudes who's been doing this a super long time, then you've got this. It's called a head knife, or sometimes people call it a half moon knife. And this is a much older, and it again takes a lot of technique and usage, and it can be used in multiple ways. The key factor with this is that these little tips allow me to start exactly at a corner, and then I can rotate the blade, or I can push and or pull the blade. Usually it will work a lot more effective. And then there's a couple other knives, like a hook knife that my friends over at Silverwolf Leather, Steve, likes to use the hook knife. Just different techniques for different ways. So cutting, those are the things that we would use to basically cut a piece of leather. Let's see what a good. What's a good starter leather that will allow me to build something strong like a corset armor, or without the material being too expensive? So is terms of like a starter leather, the only thing you can really look at is look at the price. So you can go to a place like Tandy once they open up. And it also, there's a lot of questions like, are you going to want to dye this leather? Are you going to want to make impressions on this leather? With vegetable tan leather, I can mold it. I can also stamp it. I can wet the leather and then do tooling or put a stamp design on that. If I'm doing armor, I do want some stiffness, and I also want to be able to mold it to a shape. So when I'm making something like a pauldron, then I can actually have that molded. So you also have to consider that. So you're probably looking at a veg tan leather, and you're probably looking at something at least 4 to 5 ounces, if not more. Up to 8 to 9 ounces. Tandy has a special size, double shoulder, which is the shoulders of the animal, and it's fairly affordable. And they're on sale right now, actually. So something like that would probably get you pretty far, and I think it's only like under $50, which is a incredibly great price. So we've talked about how we cut our leather. The next thing we have to do is the other ways that we manipulate our leather. One of the, and again, these are really simple tools. This is a really cheap tool. The simplest way to put a hole in leather, because you're going to want to put a rivet or something like that, is an awl, just a pokey thing, right? Here's a bigger version that at least you can sort of see, although this isn't as good for poking. This is a scratch awl. I use it for marking. But these are the traditional awls that are used to open up a hole or further make holes. A lot of people, though, of course, are going to use one of these. This is your traditional hole puncher for leather, and it has a dial that moves around, so I can have different diameters of holes. Certain rivets are going to want a different hole. If I'm going to use snaps, I want to use a different roll. There are different versions of these. This is a great thing to pick up at Harbor Freight, because I don't have one here, but they look a little different, but pretty much the same exact thing. And they're super cheap, like under 10 bucks. Okay. I'm always for like get started as cheaply as possible. And then if you like it, you can get more professional tools. This is a $50 hole puncher. Maybe not something you want to try the first time. And it works very simple. It's just like any other hole puncher. You just sort of squeeze it, and it makes a hole so that you can then put a rivet or something in there. Now, if you're stitching stuff, okay, I'll come to the questions in just a sec. If you're stitching stuff, you can also use something called a stitching chisel, okay? And this looks like a fork, and these little pokey things here, I would put this over the leather. I'm not going to do it here because it'll make everything jump. And then I'm going to hit it with my handy mallet, which I buried someplace. In the shuffle to change the devices I was using, I have inadvertently lost my mallet. There it is. You know that rule that when you spend half your time looking for your tools on your, and then I would just strike it. All right, do that real quick, actually, just for you. And now, if you can see, I have a bunch of holes in a row that I can thread through. So I'll line this up with another corresponding thing that I'm threading, and then I can, using a needle, I can sew by hand through those holes to tie everything together. So I can do 6 holes at once. They're always going to be straight. It's a lot more consistent than poking the holes one at a time. Some folks will have you use one of these little guys and do each hole. The problem is these holes are round. The diamond shaped holes that are made by this or a proper stitching awl will help lock those threads together and give you a much better stitch than something that makes the big round holes will. You of course have to decide what you're doing. If you're doing lacing or something different, it's a different kind of rule. Okay. Let me just check the comments real quick here. Yeah, somebody mentioned cardboard with duct tape is a good pattern maker thing. I don't do a lot of patterns. I just sort of make it on the fly. Because I do like a lot of bags, and bags are really just rectangles, but that's one way to use. A lot of times I start out with just regular old paper and then work from there. Is it a sin to use faux leather to start? Absolutely not. And remember, a lot of people use foam. Foam smiths like Brian and others use that and can simulate leather. It's a lot lighter. It's a little easier to use in many cases. So there's nothing wrong with using faux leather. The techniques are pretty much the same. It's not as environmentally safe as you would think, given to the whole carbon thing, and it's a plastic and stuff like that. We could, of course, argue that leather has its deficiencies as well. But if you're the problem with faux leather is that it's not actually as cheap as you would think. So you're probably looking at maybe $30 a yard in some cases for anything that's kind of got a similar feel. And then you're probably going to need to support that with some interfacing or lining to give it that rigidity you might want. If you are making a structured thing out of, like, say, like I would do. If you're doing a garment, it's probably a little better, and you can find some thinner materials that will substitute. It functions fairly similarly. So if that's something you have access to, go for it. I am not a snob. Whatever gets you making is what to me is important. A couple more questions real quick. The fork tool is called a stitching chisel. There's a lot of different varieties. Here's another stitching chisel. The teeth are just finer. Okay, so more stitching, but it's a very similar tool to that. Yes, the Harbor Freight hole punch is a lot easier to use. And yeah, geometry is included a lot. And you'll be surprised how often that you really need to use that. I do know we're getting probably pretty close to my time. If I recall, wait, 2:15. No, I go to 3. Okay, good. We got to that part. I'm sorry, I'm talking a mile a minute, and so when we're also we have a punch like this. This is also great for making holes. This one's oblong. I use it for belts. So the holes in the belts, an oblong hole will make it easier to get the prong in the hole. but they have round ones as well. And that is made by taking the punch and then striking the leather. So those, and here's a version. This one's cool. This one comes from Tandy, but you can also, I think, get these at Harbor Freight. This has a removable bit, so I can actually change the size of the diameter that I'm using. And I actually have 2 sets of these, so I don't have to switch around as much. Tandy also has a set of these come off, so they have a different spread. So some of them will have 2, some of them will have 4. Um, I highly recommend this if you're going to hand stitch. Hand stitch adds a couple elements of work to things. But those are the super simple, basic things you need. Oh, and a ruler and something to mark with to get started with leather. That's not a lot of stuff, all right? The difference is then when you want to take it to the next level and you want to make it look professional, okay? So to do that, one of the things you're going to want to do is especially with this hard leather and basically with vegetable tan, you want to do something. This is a very sharp defined edge. And if I'm joining that with another edge, it kind of looks kind of and it'll get fuzzy and stuff like that. So we use a tool called a beveler. And a beveler is sort of like a router bit that rounds the edge of a piece of wood. And that's what this does. And basically I can round that edge. So now, instead of having a square edge like on this side, I have sort of a rounded edge, okay? Now this is just the first step, because one of the next steps I'm going to do is I'm going to wet that edge, and then I'm going to take a tool like this that burnishes that edge. It smooths this edge. It takes all those fibers once they're wet and has them close together, and it helps protect the edge. Remember, a lot of leather work has to do with things that use a lot of rugged work. Now, I'm talking about the vegetable tan structured things I make. With the apparel versions, things are a little different. Some of these techniques you wouldn't do because the leather either doesn't work that way, or you wouldn't need to because you're going to fold the edges over. But just remember, a lot of this was for cowboys, was for armor, was for people who used the leather in a rugged sort of way. So by softening that edge and then burnishing it, I'm protecting the leather and I'm making it wear better and wear in a slower fashion, so it's not going to abrade, because when you're out in the middle of nowhere and your saddle breaks, you have a problem. So this helps for that. So a lot of these techniques are about making a nice clean finish. It looks nice, but it also helps protect the item. And in case of leather, I mean, I make items that are pretty expensive sometimes, and the last thing you want to do is have that break because a certain area wears. Um, I'll come right back to the finishing techniques in just a second, as far as the top coats. And then what we would do is we would wet this, and then we would take this tool and we would rub it along here. So the friction, as well as the just general squishing down of those fabric of the material of the leather fibers, will create a softer, smooth edge. Okay, that can then be treated, or will at least be more protected. And then there are things you can do to put on the edge. I actually have a special stuff called toconol that I put on the edges to help really seal that up. Another kind of neat thing and another tool is a groover. Okay, this one has a little guide piece on it, because if I'm stitching something, I want my line to be consistent the whole way. And how do I know? I mean, I could take a ruler and mark it. This just does it perfectly for me. I can just drag it all along here. And fortunately for you, this leather's dyed, so you're going to see it real easily. Okay, I created that line. Now, that line is there for a couple of reasons. Not only is it there to help me, position but that the thread to sink down lower of level. This means that thread will not get abraded as much in just normal surface contact. It actually kind of sinks down a little bit. For when you are working on those kind of things, that it helps protect it. And again, it's another sort of a cowboy era thing that helps create a better finished product. Okay. And then there's even a special wheel that you can do to help, once you sew it, you can actually force those threads down there. And whether you're saddle stitching or even a running stitch, it's still going to help. Most leather workers, if they're hand sewing stuff, will use a saddle stitch, which where each stitch is essentially a knot, and that really helps lock everything down. I'm going to get to this real quick before I forget. Somebody asked about finishing. Well, before we finish the leather, we have to dye the leather. So this kind of leather comes in, is going to look kind of like this. Okay. So this is sort of the flesh color. We oftentimes like to dye the leather. If leather is left unfinished, it will darken and change color. It gets more and more brown. So if I leave this out, it kind of gets like almost sunburnt, and it'll start to look like this. This is dyed, but it gives you the idea. Okay. And then even longer, it will get darker and darker and darker. So dye is really more of a colorant. It's what the last section that I would talk about in the 3 or 4 things we do to leather, which is adornment. And one of those is applying a dye. So different kinds of dye will penetrate more or less and better. But the bottom line is whatever leather dye you use, and you can also use dyes like RIT dye and some fabric dyes, as long as they're made sufficiently liquid enough to really absorb, think of it like wood, then you would want to treat it. So a lot of leather workers will first treat it with a wax or put oil on it, like neat's foot oil. Neat's foot oil is very commonly used. It's a little stinky, but it is very good at protecting the leather to a degree. It's not waterproof. No leather is perfectly waterproof. Any oil you put on a leather item will darken it to some degree. So you always have to be aware that putting on mink oil, not vegetable oil, stay away from vegetable oils, because I've heard a lot of different variations on that. They go rancid. I don't honestly personally know. I just stick with what the people who have been making leather products and for decades use, because I figure they must know something. So 100% neat's foot oil is good. There are some other products out there like Aussie cream that is both a protected and a sort of softens the leather that you can put on it. Most leather workers will treat it with an oil to help for absorption and maybe to make it a little softer. I top coat mine with a wax. And if I know it's something that's going to get a lot more water exposure, then I'll use something called Resolene, which is like an acrylic coating. There's also lacquers out there. So many cases, when you receive an item from a leathersmith, there's nothing you need to do to it for a while, other than gently wipe it with a moist cloth, a damp cloth. If it gets dirty, there is stuff that will collect. Remember, any dirt, oils, and things that collect on leather will also attract dirt, and then that dirt attracts other things, and we have a bad time. Saddle soap is traditionally used for cleaning and for helping making it a little bit more flexible, but there's a lot of other products out there that you can use that are equally useful for that kind of things. Someone told me that you cannot dye suede after it's manufactured. Is that true? Certain, to a degree, yes. It's very challenging. Understand that in many cases, if it's a commercial or factory produced suede, it's already dyed. So there's a dye in there. If you want to make it darker, you can. If you use an alcohol based or an oil based dye from Thebings, for example, you will have no problem in changing that color, but it's going to be kind of a shit show guess as to what color you're going to get. But if you want to make it like a dark brown or black, you can probably manage to do that. Absorbent, it will suede a lot, but that is true in terms of suede. Suede's a little weird. Now remember, suede. So when they make leather pieces of anything, the leather is thick. It's maybe a quarter of an inch or more thick. It's the skin, and they actually split that leather, and they take off the top layer, and then you have this that's got that sort of smoother part. Remember, this smooth part, because it's the outer layer of the skin, is stronger. It lends strength to it. And it is what's going to keep it a little bit stronger and more durable than, say, a suede. Suedes, like in shoes, appear to wear better simply because there's no top layer to wear off. It's actually an underdermis layer. So you see how these are kind of fuzzy on the back. I really can't really tell. But that is sort of what you're looking at as an underpart. Suedes are actually sort of a step down in terms of leather. Let's see, octopus difold. Yes, I'm glad that you got that. Thank you. Yeah. So in terms of embossing and different kinds of tooling, what you would do, and you can only do this with veg tan leather for the most part. You can use heat on the chromium tan leather, like the soft flexible stuff, and it will create you can use it for a stamp, or you could actually literally brand it, and you can use foil and stuff like that. But to be really truly flexible with what you're doing, you would want to use a vegetable tan leather. You're going to moisten this leather and let it sit for a while, called casing. And once it's properly moistened, remember the collagen in there is like a glue. Once it's properly moistened, then you can take little stamps that look like teeny tiny chisels. Okay, this is the chisel, all right? And this particular one has a knurled face on it, all right? Now, it looks so super big until you realize it's really teeny tiny. And then I'm gonna the leather just partially through the surface. And then I would use the tool to make that row of impressions. And what we do when we do a lot of embossing and tooling is we create the perception of a lot. It's like a bas relief, if you know what that is. You're basically creating a embossing and debossing thing where you're raising one layer by lowering the layer beside it, and it makes it look more three-dimensional. And then with the addition of some dyes, and you can make it look super three-dimensional, even though the difference between the lowest and the highest is maybe 1 or 2 millimeters. Um, so that is it's another level of technique. Now, if you're going to stamp your name on it, or there's like gear stamps and stuff like that, then you're going to wet it and you just kind of whack it, and there you go. It's pretty simple. The tooling technique, or sometimes called leather carving, is far more involved. It's not specifically hard, but it can be challenging because there's a lot to learn and a lot of trial and error and practice that goes with it. It also can be challenging because there's all these people telling you how to do all these different things. Casing, the moistening part of the leather alone, there's like 50 different. Some people have you sticking it in a refrigerator for 24 hours and doing this, and you turn around and swear to the leather gods and all these other things. And again, maybe it works for them. I wet it, and within a half an hour, I'm tooling. So best is talk to different people and do what works with you. Watch YouTube videos, lots of resources out there. I'm always happy to answer questions. I do have some YouTube tutorials, and that's another option. And again, if I can, I'm always willing to help people with any kind of questions. What's the most rewarding aspect of what you and how you do what you do? I love making creative stuff that people love, but that's also useful. It's so cool to see somebody geek out on something you made for them, and it doesn't matter what that is. I remember I made a barber's apron when we first started out, and it took me a while, and I learned a lot of lessons in the process, but it was just a simple apron. Aprons aren't, there's a lot of leather, but it's not too difficult. And to see a 250-pound bearded black barber going, "Woo!" is just incredible, because like, here's this big dude and he is just pleased as an 8-year-old. And that made me so happy, even though I lost money, because I didn't charge him. So for me, it's just seeing people just really love what I make and the opportunity to create something cool, because sometimes people say, "Hey, I'd like a belt." And I'm like, okay, awesome. That's like, don't get me wrong, I don't consider myself like Picasso, but that's like asking Picasso to paint your wall. So sometimes I don't. Okay, so yes, it's all about me sometimes. No, seriously, I like when I have that opportunity to make something really creative that person loves, that allows them to be that thing they want to be, whether it's a cosplay, whether it's they want to look like a badass businessman or whether they want to look like some cool steampunk thing or person. That is just makes me happy because they're happy and they get to be transform into something positive, something that is them. That's what really makes me happy. And that to me is rewarding. Um, it's not really about the money for me. It's about the making of stuff. That being said, I still have to eat, but for me, that's really the most rewarding part. I know we're getting really close to the end. I'm sure I have given you short shrift on lots of things. I have a whole pile of tools I didn't even get to. Um, but I'm always willing to share stuff and hopefully I'll be doing some of these and definitely hopefully can do some of these live when we meet up in hopefully October, and we can share these things. And I might do something like this. I've done a couple, and I will hope to do some more where I just share what I love about leather making and try to teach people how to do the cool stuff. Um, and I appreciate everybody who's been here. I don't know how many people have actually been online, but there's I really appreciate everybody who's chimed in with comments. I was kind of expecting crickets. Um, and Oh, that was Brian with that all question. Geez, I didn't really even realize I wasn't looking at the names. So, the thing that I made for myself that I love the most is my top hat. It's probably one of my favorite things because it's sort of become my own personal identity now. Everybody, like, I went to a con and people didn't even know who I was because, well, I didn't have my top hat. I was loading in, and they were like, "Oh, it's Don. I didn't recognize you without your top hat." So I really like top hats because it's like instant identity. And then I just like the armor and fun stuff like that. But yeah, that's kind of the thing that I've made for me that I because I don't make a lot of stuff for me. I have a significant lack of my stuff, and it took me a couple years before I actually built my own stuff for my own character. I think we are running up against the time there, and I certainly want everybody's because I think Colleen is coming up next talking about hats. And yes, that segue was totally intentional. And she's going to teach you how to make some cool hats. And I'm going to try to watch that if my all my batteries don't run out. We're going to be collaborating on some cool stuff too, so look for that coming up. So with that, I will sit here nervously while Diane does whatever she needs to do to help us. She's been a peach doing all the crazy stuff behind the scenes because everybody has their own technological issues. So um, I appreciate everybody coming out, and thank you, Joseph. Yes, it's one of my favorites, the hat. Oh, there's Colleen.